Hello everyone, I'm Dan Albus, the Member of Parliament for Okanagan, Lake West, South Kelowna, and welcome to the Finding Solutions podcast, where I interview people that inspire me and hopefully will inspire you. Today we're very honored to have Adam Chambers, who serves as the second time elected Member of Parliament for Simcoe North. And Adam is one of our bright stars of the Conservative caucus. He's been featured on CBC panels, and he's known very much for his thoughtful approach. And I think you'll really enjoy some of the topics that we have today. So we're going to dive right in. Adam, thanks so much for being here.
Dan, thanks for the invitation. This is fantastic.
Okay, so you and I were talking in the House, because we sit next to each other, about something fantastic that happened in your riding over the weekend. And it delights everyone to talk about it. So what is this festival, and why should Canadians from coast to coast to coast care about this?
Well, at a time where we need great national symbols, my hometown, Midland, Ontario, hosted Canada's best butter tart festival in a town of just over, around 16,000. Between 50 and 60,000 people showed up to descend on that town in order to consume or purchase hundreds of thousands of butter tarts. It was well over 200,000. That was the number last year, and some people are suggesting it's much higher than even 200,000.
So you could argue you have the sweetest riding in Canada.
You're good. I like those jokes. I'm going to use that one. We definitely have the sweetest riding. Sweet Tooths were out in full force on Saturday.
And I understand that because of this great festival, there is a national petition that has been launched. Explain that.
Well, so there is a petition about wanting to have a national butter tart day, but as you can imagine, there are a number of different ideas about when the day should be. So there is multiple thousands of people who would love to see the butter tart recognized as a national symbol. You know, we do have Nanaimo Bar Day, and we do have National Poutine Day. So, why not National Butter Tart Day?
Well, I'm glad you were talking about Nanaimo. Obviously, our colleague from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, believes that she is the sweetest riding. Maybe we'll have her on at some point to argue about why. But let's talk about you for a moment, because you got into politics, from a bit of an unconventional route. You started first, as I believe, as a page. Is that correct?
Not a page, but I was an intern in shortly after the 2006 election for that first summer, working in Toronto. Jim Flaherty was the regional minister for Toronto. So if you can imagine, after the 2006 election, the closest seat that we had for a minister in Toronto was actually in Whitby, which was a little bit further away. Wasn't in the downtown core, but as the minister responsible for Toronto, in addition to being the Minister of Finance, I was an intern in our office, his office in Toronto.
So again, you got a chance to meet Jim Flaherty, to work alongside him as an intern. So what did you learn from Jim Flaherty then and later on when he was minister?
A great question. Many things I hold dear to me still. A couple things stand out in particular. First was he always had a very strong view of public service. It was something that he talked about often, about having, being blessed with the opportunities as a lawyer to do many things, but that public service was a high calling. And the other was I saw him as a fierce opponent or combatant in the political arena, but he also had this ability to find human moments with his opponents kind of outside of the arena or off the field, as people say. So I took from that lessons. Public service is important. In fact, he did a speech, Public Service is Good for You, which is a fantastic speech he gave to a business school at Western. And so that was always, I took that very, very to heart. But then also, I think, in our jobs, we spend a lot of time arguing or maybe offering differing opinions, but that it doesn't really ever get personal in the sense that you can't have a regular conversation with your person across the aisle at the end of the day.
So, because you worked for Minister Flaherty, what's one personal story that you can convey that our viewers here would just love to hear that kind of opens, gives a little glimpse into working with Jim Flaherty?
Well, it was kind of funny. It was my first real job, working as an intern so it was my first political job. But then I took a couple years off of law school to work for him in Ottawa after I finished my first year of law school. And I thought, okay, well, I'm his assistant. I'm there to help him. I'll carry his bags. I'll do basically whatever. And I remember I went to grab a bag of his off of a baggage carousel, and he walked over, he grabbed it out of my hand, he says, "I can take my own bags." And I think that was just a funny moment between us. You just want to help out as the young, you're eager to help out. But his independence was important to him, certainly in his role. So the things that he could control, he still liked to control. And carrying his bags was one of those things.
So in 2021, you were elected. You have children. What has life been like as an MP that was maybe you didn't quite expect as someone who had worked for an MP or for a minister previous?
That is a fantastic question, because I do talk about this with my spouse, Jane, who also worked in politics. She worked for Michael Ignatieff and was on the plane during Michael's election defeat. Both of us worked in politics before, so we knew, kind of what we were getting into, so to speak. I think the thing that I certainly underestimated, and perhaps even Jane as well, is, when we worked in politics previously, different age and stage of life. I was single at least, didn't have children. I think what perhaps I underestimated is the dynamic with children in politics and the jobs that we do here, with respect to the travel and obviously the time commitments. And, you have a lot further travel than I do, being from Central Ontario. I'm blessed in the sense that most weeks I know I will be home within 5 hours of leaving here, whether I drive or I fly. And so I think it's a challenge, even if it's a challenge in my life for some of those logistics. I know that I'm sure folks that are traveling much further like yourself also experience that.
Well, a former minister had told me that the biggest thing to watch out for was for that phone call where you're stuck in Ottawa, the connections to get back to British Columbia aren't good, and suddenly you have a child who's just fallen out of a tree, broken their arm, and you can't be there. So I totally sympathize with any member of Parliament that's trying to be a good mom, a good dad, to do their best to be a good partner, while being a good MP for their constituents. Now, when you first came here and you were elevated to the shadow cabinet, it was principally for the Canada Revenue Agency was where your beat, so to speak.
That's right. The easiest shadow cabinet job, I think, because most people have challenges with the CRA, so it wasn't too hard to find those with some helpful suggestions on how CRA can improve.
Oh, absolutely. And so one of the ones that has appeared over the years and continues to be a problem to this day, because I know that I brought to you the case of a Kelowna company that had figured out a better mousetrap, as it were, like something that all of us as MPs want to have. What they were doing is they were getting mortgage verification. One of the principal challenges that banks, mortgage brokers, and other lenders have is whether or not someone actually has the income that they say they are. And the gold standard is the notice of assessment through CRA, because that is a number that they have, they've staked it on legally, that this is what your assessed income was for a particular year. So when you're trying to verify their income, that's really important. This company had figured out a way to do this utilizing the existing system that is often utilized for, whether it be for H&R Block or for another tax preparer or for an accountant, to use that same verification so they could find that out. Now, it was a great service, but when CRA found out about this, they ended up shutting down access and defining access. And that's had a lot of impacts. That company has since closed, as far as I understand. So, the issue, if we fast forward to today, I know I was just checking out the tweets of Ron Butler, the angry mortgage broker. He's very prolific on X and goes on a lot of podcasts. And he says that this issue is still vexing the industry. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the verification process and what the lack of action by CRA to make this happen has left the industry.
Sure. I mean, first, just to back on how we got onto this issue, it's correct. I remember you connecting me with that company, entrepreneurial individual who had something the market wanted, which was an ability for lenders to know, well, what this individual is telling me on the mortgage application is actually correct. Mortgage fraud is a serious problem in the country, and a number of people have raised this as a solution or suggested a suggestion, including Ron Butler, who's been almost like a broken record on this. Time and time again, he's made this recommendation. The government belatedly even suggested they were going to do it, but I think they felt they were forced to say this. This is maybe 18 months ago. Said they would do something, and we have still yet to see any progress or any update. And in a way, I feel a little bit of sympathy for CRA, rank and file employees who have been asked to do so many things outside of their core mandate, which is to, enforce and collect, enforce the Tax Act and collect monies owing to government. But the government has asked them to do a number of different things. Give out during COVID, they had to distribute all of the benefits. They've had to implement some very complicated tax rules like the underused housing tax and Bear Trust. All of these things have distracted them from the core mandate. However, from a money laundering perspective and from recommendations from law enforcement and the financial services sector, adding this capability wasn't very difficult because, as you mentioned, there was a company that was already able to do this. The fact that it's not been done yet just tells you it's not a priority for the government. And in fact, I don't think it's a surprise that if you look as default rates have increased across the country, these default rates are actually increasing in the same areas of the country where there have been high degrees of mortgage fraud. So as we enter a period of potential uncertainty in the housing market, or as people refinance, it's been tougher as some house prices have fallen, depending on where you are in the country. If there has been fraud, you're more likely to be kind of found out now at this point than you were before, when house prices just keep increasing. People were faking tax documents, even from the CRA, but then faking pay stubs from employers. This would have been a way, or would be a way, for the banks to know whether the paper you're giving them or the information you're giving them is in fact correct. The U.S. has been doing this for years, by the way, and doesn't have a challenge doing so. And the fact that there was an individual company who had figured this out and knew that there was a market for it, and the government basically shut them down, I think is it's unfortunate for sure.
Well, and especially, and just for viewers to know that, first of all, they always got consent from the person, because the bank, I remember seeing that they had multiple large banks actually write in favor of this company to continue its services because they found it so efficient and it verified the truth. So again, you have a consenting individual that they were giving a third party that was an accountant to be able to access, and even a more limited system where he just said, "Is this number accurate?" And you just get a green light or red light back. Is all that they were looking for. Anyway, I appreciated your advocacy for this, and
I still think we still have to stay on the government for this. I still think it's an issue certainly worth pursuing, and folks like Ron, who've continued to push us, I think are doing the right thing, because eventually the government's going to have to listen.
Yes, and so I guess I'll be writing my question period question for this one coming up. So further than that kind of gave you the ground, though, for examining CRA as an organization. And I think that led probably to your private members bill, which has been a big success so far in terms of this CRA debt registry private members bill. Maybe you can explain to constituents what you were trying to do and the reception you've gotten for the bill.
Sure. So just as quickly as I can. The CRA is the primary debt collector for the government. So if you owe taxes, you owe excise taxes, the CRA is going to be the agency that will call and ask for the money. And what ends up happening is, like any business that is in charge of collecting, if you're in charge of collections, there's a certain amount of money you write off every year. You can't collect it for whatever reason. Some of our colleagues, a few years before I was even elected, were noticing that the number of write-offs per year were increasing, and eventually ended up substantially increasing. Forget COVID. Those were obviously, write-offs were high, but even when you remove COVID, billions of dollars are being written off every year. In 2015, it was about maybe $3 billion a year. Last year, it was closer to $7 billion a year. And so this number is going up and up and up. We started to ask questions. I say we because our colleagues, conservative colleagues on Finance Committee and previous shadow ministers of CRA were asking questions about, well, who's getting these large write-offs? Who are these corporations? And the CRA for a long time would say, well, the largest write-off we did last year was X, and they would give you a number. One year it was maybe $199 million, around $200 million. And then all of a sudden CRA stopped even giving that level of transparency. And they reverted to, well, there's privacy considerations in the Income Tax Act and there's the Privacy Act. So we can't give you the largest write-off because you might be then able to figure out whose identity that is. And remember, we're talking about corporations. We're talking about corporations, not people. So my personal belief is that a corporation who owes the government $300 million and decides not to pay does not deserve any privacy protections for their identity. And so that is the general basis for this bill, which is basically every time the government writes off, waives, or forgives a debt owing to the government. So it could be from a loan that the government gives a company, or it could be for taxes owing. If that debt is written off and it's in excess of $2 million, and I'll come back to the $2 million threshold, that detail of which corporation it was, why it was written off, and how much should be public. And I was very happy to see that bill got passed unanimously just a few weeks ago, and so it now is over in the Senate, and I look forward to working with our wonderful Senate colleagues to show them the importance of this bill to give greater access and transparency to Canadians, effectively taxpayers, but of course parliamentarians, who can then hold the agency and decision makers accountable for making some of these write-offs.
And I think from the agency's perspective, this would at least have a cut and dried process for when they disclose, how much they disclose, under what terms, and that Parliament has endorsed it. So I think that this actually helps the Revenue Agency and for better accountability for taxpayers.
Exactly. And can I just give one stat, which is, we found out we were on the right path because it turned out in 1 year, the top 10 corporations had over $1.1 billion in monies owed to the government written off. So it tells you that there is a lot of this activity happening. And so the question was, where do we set the threshold? We had proposed a $1 million threshold. The government was interested in a much higher threshold of at least $5 million or more. And part of our jobs is to find some compromise. I did not want to hold out for the perfect bill if it meant that we could have the bill pass. Mm-hmm. And so we discussed as a team and settled with the government, made an agreement with the government and the bloc on the committee that we would increase the threshold to $2 million, but that meant the government would support the legislation, which helped it ultimately pass. And so while I would have preferred a lower threshold, in fact, some of our colleagues wanted a very, very low threshold, but it meant that the bill was able to advance into the Senate, and so it has a chance of becoming law. So I think that was an interesting part of the process to watch from my perspective, as it was my first time a private member's bill, made it to committee for study.
Well, absolutely. You want to see something good happen with the knowledge that you've gained so far. Okay, so it's in the Senate right now. What stage is that at?
So it just finished. It's done his first reading, and there's some second reading speeches coming up. I hope that we'll get those finished before the summer. And Senator David Wells on our side, as a conservative senator, is sponsoring the legislation in the Senate. And my critic in the Senate is Percy Down, Senator Percy Down, a Liberal-appointed senator, but he's been very on top of issues related to CRA and transparency. So Percy and I have actually worked together on a few things, including one of his bills that I'm sponsoring on the House side. And so I'm hopeful that with a unanimous vote in the House of Commons, that the Senate will eventually agree with us in the lower chamber and pass the bill, and we'll see what happens.
Well, that's great, Adam. So Senator Down has proposed another piece of legislation that has now passed the Senate, and now you are sponsoring. So you're kind of stick handling that. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about what that bill intends, because I think it's very similar to what you've proposed in making CRA a little bit more transparent to the average taxpayer.
That's right. I think the bills are complementary to each other, so they both deal with a level of transparency. Mr. Down bill, Senator Down's bill, has a few key pieces to it. First is the government publicly disclose individuals who are convicted, not arrested or prosecuted, but convicted of tax evasion on a regular basis. So that's item one. Then there's a notion of a tax gap. And the tax gap is basically the amount of money that CRA believes Canadians owe the CRA or that corporations owe the CRA versus what is collected. So it's the taxes assessed versus taxes collected. Many other countries in the world do very deep analysis on what they call the tax gap. You know, it's a measure of efficiency of how well CRA is doing at their primary objective. And Senator Down's bill would require the CRA to publicly report to Parliament its tax gap on a certain interval, and then finally also make sure that information available for discussion or analysis of the tax gap is more easily available to the parliamentary budget officer, who is an independent officer of Parliament, which could also perform analysis on the tax gap, which would bring us a little bit more in line with what other countries do around the world. But again, a level of transparency from the CRA on its core mandate, which is to enforce the Tax Act and collect monies owed to the government.
So essentially, you and Senator Down, between your various measures, are trying to make the CRA a more transparent agency, so Canadians can know that their one job that they've been handled, it's being done properly.
Absolutely, and I think that's Senator Down's been. By the way, this is the third time that Senator Down has got his bill out of the Senate and to the House of Commons. Both times previous, once the government at the time, Liberal government at the time, voted it down, and this second time we had an election, and so that prevented it from going any further. But now that it looks like we might not have an election for the next number of months, it might be an opportunity for us to pass the bill finally in the House side, because Senator Down has been on this topic for a very long time and is known as an expert in the goings-on at CRA, but transparency, and specifically international tax evasion. So I was really happy to work with him on this, maybe unlikely bedfellows, him being a Liberal-appointed senator, but on this issue, and others, of course, but on this issue, we're strong alignment and an agreement to work together to change the statutes of Canada for the betterment of not just the country, but transparency for taxpayers and parliamentarians.
Well, I think it's great what you're doing, and especially given that this proposal has been tried various times. I do hope that the third time is the charm. Yeah. So you are now moved away, though. Your shadow cabinet critic role is no longer the CRA. You've been given a much bigger assignment because international trade is an important area for the country. Both the government and the opposition have said that the trade diversification is really important. I know under Stephen Harper, under his premiership, the Harper government ended up getting, 55 different free trade agreements around the world. I might be a few off, or I might be a few over, but essentially, trade, I think, is a good thing. So when you first laid eyes on this portfolio, here's your new assignment. What were some of your observations, and what have you seen since you started working with the committee and other members?
Sure. I mean, the interesting thing about trade, as you noted, Prime Minister Harper, strong free trader, comes into power and really has an ambitious trade agenda, partially shepherded by, of course, Ed Fass, who was International Trade Minister for a number of years. And it's interesting because I'm not sure other jurisdictions around the world have the same dynamic where the two largest political parties are both strongly pro-free trading. And so, at least between us and the government on the issue of growing Canada's trade and trade diversification, I'll say there's general alignment. Do we need more free trade deals? Yes. Should we deepen the ties we already have? Yes. What I found interesting is that it seems to me that many of the quote-unquote trade deals that the government is suggesting that they have signed aren't, in effect, actual trade deals. What they are memorandums of understanding that say, well, at a future date, we might agree to. Now, our understanding is that the government is actually in negotiations with Mercosur countries, in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, as well as India, and they have an ambitious idea to want to have 2 new trade deals signed, I think, by the end of the calendar year. The government did sign, or the Prime Minister Carney did bring in a trade deal that had been previously negotiated by Justin Trudeau's government, which is free trade with Indonesia. The challenge with some of these new deals, let's just take Indonesia as an example. In a few years, the free trade deal with Indonesia might increase GDP to Canada by 0.012%. So we need to diversify our trade, but we have to be realistic, I think, about the reality is living where we live and with language and common cultural ties and familial ties, that the United States is and will still remain our largest trading partner. And what I have found interesting in my observations is, I think, the observation is that the government has, deprioritized engagement with Americans in favor of trying to do what I'll call trade deals around the world, some of which aren't actually trade deals, and others are quite small in the grand scheme of things in terms of what future opportunity will provide the Canadian economy. So it's not that we should ignore the rest of the world and just focus all on the U.S. I think that's partially why we're in a bit of this challenge now. But I think we have to do both things at once. And I think it's been clear that the government's obviously deprioritized the conversations with Americans. You look at how Mexico has been dealing with the Americans. They have been at the table in multiple occasions, kind of informal discussion, like with formal discussions, where Canada has not engaged. And if you go back to the renegotiation of NAFTA, which became what we call CUSMA or USMCA, in that negotiation, it was the U.S. and Mexico, which were hunkered down for weeks, and I'm quoting Robert Lighthizer book, who was chief trade negotiator, USTR, under President Trump, hunkered down for weeks, and Canada was nowhere in those negotiations, and was basically given an opportunity to sign on to the deal that the United States and Mexico had already chosen. And my observation is we're kind of going down that same path. Mexico and the U.S. have been having formal discussions. They've been at the table, and we have not. Now, of course, with a deadline looming of July 1st, there will be some tripartite. It sounds like there will be some tripartite discussions. But in many ways, the U.S. and Mexico may have already made a lot of progress on the areas where we would have preferred to have Canadian input.
So on July 1st, Canada and the CUSMA, or USMCA, whatever you want to call it, the new NAFTA, doesn't just turn into a pumpkin. And so what practical implications happen when we hit that July 1st deadline?
Well, the implications are it's one of uncertainty. I think, most rational folks, the business communities, both in Canada, the US, and Mexico, and even folks in and around the Trump administration, I think most recognize that there will be some agreement that is in place between the three countries. Now, there's some discussion about whether it be a bilateral agreement between Mexico and the US and then Canada and the US. But there is broad alignment that we still want to trade with each other. The issue for Canada is one of uncertainty. Business investment in this country is down 5 quarters in a row, which is largely unheard of, certainly outside of a recession. If you put yourself in the position of a business owner in Canada, if you're thinking to expand, but you're not sure that you can sell your products into the US, you're probably not going to expand. If you are already in Canada, but you might have US operations, and it's unclear whether you will have the same kind of access into the US, you may have already moved some production into the United States. So this uncertainty about what the agreement might look like or how this will work is actually determining business decisions today,
yes,
which I think is a big, big challenge for this country, which is why the government is implying that there is no cost to waiting to negotiate with the Americans. You've heard the expression, well, they're going to rake the puck, they're going to wait for the US midterms to finish in November. There is a cost to waiting, and that is uncertainty and levels of business investment, and people are already seeing some job losses now because of operations that have moved. Of course, these businesses are trying to diversify into other markets, but that's certainly not an overnight option for many of these folks. And as I say, I think it's cooling investment activity as people wait to see what's going to happen.
Well, and to your point on the uncertainty and the chill that has, I'm going to point a good situation and a not so good situation. Both of them aren't great in the total scheme of things, but Toyota Canada, right now it's the parent company in Japan that is paying the 25% tariff every time a Canadian Toyota vehicle comes off the lot and gets sent to the United States. The parent company is picking that up because their representative told me that they believe in Canada and they want to get past this trade issues with the United States because they think it's bad for everyone involved. So that's an example of where some companies know that the relationship is important and vital and want to try and bridge that over. On the flip side, we have Honda that has said that they need to have some sort of sense of surety if they're going to continue to invest and build their cars here in Canada. So I think you've raised, and that's just one sector in your home province.
Well, you're pulling at my heartstrings being from Ontario and in my region. Auto is a significant contributor to the local economy. Both Honda and Toyota, it has to be said, are excellent corporate citizens in the sense that for their entire time operating here, they have never issued a layoff notice, which I think is certainly commendable. There's not many companies, certainly manufacturing, that can say that they have the track record like that in terms of a commitment to the employees, but a commitment to the country. Both Honda and Toyota, despite having very decent and quite good operational years in terms of number of cars produced and sold and efficiency metrics. Honda just announced they had quite a large financial loss last year. My understanding is Toyota, after the tariffs are accounted for, also lost on their Canadian, maybe even North American operations. This is long-term, it's just not sustainable.
Yes.
The odd thing, we are told that President Trump, we're told that the only thing he cares about in trade is whether you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit with a country. In automobiles, the Americans enjoy a multi-billion-dollar trade surplus with Canada. We are not, quote-unquote, the problem. when it comes to autos in North America. In fact, the deal that they currently have, which is tariff-free access between the countries before the president imposed tariffs, was actually working quite well for the Americans as it relates between Canada and the US. So we have to remind the president and those around him that the deal that the president negotiated actually was in America's interest if you're looking at that metric, on that metric that we care so much about. But if you just think about it, Canada purchases about, call it 2 million, 1.8, maybe 2 million cars a year. We're producing 1.2, 1.3 million a year. We're importing a heck of a lot of vehicles from the US tariff-free. I think it would be very reasonable to say, well, at the very least, for every vehicle we bring into Canada tariff-free, we should be able to send one that is assembled here from Canada into the US tariff-free. I mean, that is the basis of free and fair trade, reciprocal trade, right? Reciprocity is kind of the foundation of free trade. Getting back at least to an acknowledgement of that as a baseline, and then wanting to discuss other ideas that would strengthen the North American supply chain in automobiles, I think is a logical conversation to have with the Americans. But again, because Canada and the US are not engaged in formal discussions currently, this is a discussion that has not happened.
Yes.
And so, you know, and I know in your province, like softwood lumber, if you're not talking, you're not coming up to a solution. And I think there's a difference between, you know, some people would say, well, do the Conservatives just want Canada to take the first deal that's offered and to, you know, give in to all of Trump's demands? No. We're recommending what we tell any organization that's in a protracted negotiation. Take, for example, between union and management. What do most people say? Get to the table. We don't say make a deal. We say get to the table, because your solutions and issues and irritants will be discussed and dealt with at the table. Because if you're not at the table, it's certainly not going to, no deal's going to happen.
Well, I'm glad you raised softwood lumber, because this is an area of rare agreement where David Eby, the Premier of my province, and myself are in complete agreement that Mark Carney has not made softwood lumber a loud issue with this CUSMA renegotiation.
In fact, I'm not sure. You're completely right. Interestingly, you bring that up. I'm not sure I've actually heard the Prime Minister use the term softwood lumber frequently or at all.
And typically what happens is softwood lumber is treated outside the NAFTA regime. So, you know, British Columbians, myself included, absolutely want to see softwood lumber being at the bargaining table while we're talking about autos, while we're talking about steel and aluminum. We want that to be a category that is right there on the table, because just like automobiles, you know, Americans benefit greatly from our softwood products, and because it reduces prices and it keeps housing affordable on both sides of the border.
Absolutely. And you'll recall, under Prime Minister Harper, there was a softwood agreement. And if President Trump would like to build more homes in the United States, and they need to get lumber from somewhere, why not get it from Canada? I think it's an argument that can be made for using it softwood, because use it in automobiles as well. If you need to import automobiles because you cannot build all of the ones that are consumed or purchased in your country, why not get those things from Canada instead of going outside of North America and, you know, strengthening the manufacturing capability and dominance of other countries around the world? Why not have this stuff, if you can't onshore it, reshore it or friendshore, I think is the term that people use, if you can't do it all domestically. And frankly, on a number of these issues, like aluminum as an example, there is not even the capacity for the United States to produce the aluminum that they need. So why would we not be their first best option, if not themselves?
These are all excellent points, Adam, and I guess we're just going to have to see whether Dominic LeBlanc and Prime Minister Carney, you know, take up these issues, because I think we've made the case here right for them. So feel free, Prime Minister Carney, steal Adam Chambers' very words and strategies here to do that. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about you because you've also been an advocate for a very small democratic country, Taiwan. Could you just tell us, what got you working on the Taiwan file, and how does it work? How does it link with your work as the international trade shadow minister?
Absolutely. So in taking the new portfolio, obviously I'd spent most of my time on the finance committee previously, so it's an opportunity to branch out and explore other parts of the world and to see where there are opportunities for Canada to grow their trading relationships. Taiwan is a very interesting part of the world. It is directly located beside or across from an actor who is a hostile actor in many ways, both from subversive tactics, from say electoral interference or things of that nature, but then also militarily, doing incursions through the Taiwan Strait, and then also air through the air with its military aircraft, and as a conservative. Areas in the world that are struggling to preserve democracy and freedom, I think, is something I'm interested in generally. And so being on the international trade file gave me the opportunity to learn a little bit more about that region and certainly have an opportunity to speak with officials there. I was able to travel there in January and learn a bit more about their struggle in dealing with a difficult neighbor right next door, with whom they trade immense a number of goods with. And so they've been able to manage that relationship without certain risks, of course. But I think Canada, everyone likes to talk about the Prime Minister's Davos speech, where he talked about, the global hegemons taking advantage of middle powers and needing for middle powers to look out for each other, so to speak. Well, I think countries like Canada should be looking out for places like Taiwan who share similar democratic values. Mm-hmm. They have free and fair elections, and they are free traders by their very nature. Because they are an island, they are totally dependent on trade. Canada and Taiwan have so much in common, especially with, as the relationship between Canada and the U.S. has been fractured to some degree. Taiwan and China obviously have this, very, very deep fracture. And we should be doing what we can to help strengthen the relationship between Canada and Taiwan. And so, as an example, there's a Taiwan-Canadian Trade Cooperation Framework Agreement that has been finished and signed, and it's just sitting on the Prime Minister's desk awaiting for an official signing ceremony.
So let me get this straight. So the Prime Minister has made the argument to diversify. He's also made the argument that middle powers that share democratic values should work together on issues. To me, it sounds like Taiwan would be the perfect fit of those two concepts together: market diversification, growth on both sides, and working together against regional hegemons. So why isn't it going forward?
You would think that would be the case. This agreement had been negotiated and finalized over a year ago. So the Prime Minister Trudeau's government had been negotiating it. It had been finalized, I think, in March of last year. And the only thing left is just waiting for it to be, an official signing ceremony to put it into place, which would have significant benefits for Canadian businesses. It is a puzzle. It's puzzling why the government hasn't chosen to act more quickly on it for all the items you outline. We talk about wanting to be friends with or get closer with democratic allies around the world. And by the way, in the region, Taiwan is deepening relationships with Japan, with Korea, right?
These are all countries we have free trade agreements with.
Exactly. And so we are seemingly, it would appear, making decisions to get closer to a country like China, which doesn't happen to share the same values as us. And by the way, for those who dislike President Trump or they're nervous about the Canada-U.S. relationship going forward, the United States has elections. China does not. Mm-hmm. And China's, posture and positioning is unlikely to change over time. And they take some very drastic measures in terms of, not only have they held farmers hostage through tariffs, they've actually captured Canadian citizens in the two Michaels. So we should, in my view, we should be doing what we can to strengthen our relationships with countries with whom we already share so many things with, political system, legal system.
So do you think, Adam, that the Prime Minister is holding back because he doesn't want to alienate himself from China proper?
Well, I think there's no real other explanation. There hasn't been certainly any explanation provided why they wouldn't just finalize the agreement.
Because even Justin Trudeau, I remember when I was on Finance Committee, we actually had two parallel studies on two double taxation treaties. One with the People's Republic of China, I think it was through Hong Kong, and the other one was Taiwan proper. And even the Trudeau government didn't hold back on signing these agreements. They put them into law.
Right. And as I mentioned, it was the Trudeau government that had started negotiating this new updated Taiwan-Canada Trade Cooperation Framework arrangement. So this seems, there really is not an explanation other than maybe some pressure from Beijing to not normalize relations with or get closer to Taiwan. Also evidenced by the fact that the Chinese ambassador in Canada has suggested that parliamentarians no longer travel to Taiwan. And that seems to be an odd request coming from a third-party country. They've also made the request that Canada doesn't send any more of its naval vessels to Taiwan, which is an odd kind of request. But then you see the government, downplaying some of the relationships with Taiwan, recalling a few of its members, two of its members on a trip from Taiwan in January. So
signing cooperation agreements between the RCMP and Chinese police services.
And exactly.
The list goes on, and the list goes on.
So really, the data points are pointing to the fact that the Prime Minister is doing so in an effort to please or get closer to Beijing.
Yeah, I don't think when people said, let's diversify our trade, it meant specifically going to a country like China. But anyway, I think
we should not trade U.S. dependence on trade for Chinese dependence on trade. I think that's a fair assessment.
That's a very fair assessment. Well, Adam, I want to thank you for the work that you do in our Conservative caucus, because I know these issues are complicated. I know you have a brilliant mind for it and the enthusiasm to it. And thank you again for your service, because I know when you're a young father, being away from your family, particularly your kids, it can be very hard on you, it can be very hard on your spouse. So please pass on our best to your whole family.
No, thank you very much, Dan. I've really appreciated getting to work with you and knowing you, and I'm glad that you do these kinds of things that help people learn a little bit more about what goes on in Ottawa, and you've been a fantastic friend and mentor to me as I'm just getting my feet under me as a new MP.
Well, I think you're probably over exaggerating the mentor side, but all I can simply say, you've had some fantastic mentors when you look at guys like Jim Flaherty. Anyway, folks, I just want to thank you to our audience for listening in with my conversation today with Adam Chambers. Everything from a National Butter Tart Day to USMCA and to our relationship with China and Taiwan. So it's been a big conversation. Adam, thank you again for your service. And folks, we have a great library of finding solutions. So there's Adam, but there's also a number of people within the Conservative caucus and also provincially, as well as civil society figures that are trying to make a difference. So there's a big list there. So if you want to go on to our YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, you'll see them there. I'm Dan Elvis. Thank you for watching Finding Solutions.